He was a man of rhythms. The sun's climb was the rhythm of the bellows, a soft leather sigh, followed by the roar of coal-catching flame. Midday was the hammer's beat, a steady driving percussion that shaped the will of iron and was the only voice that answered him in the lonely clearing. The evening was the hiss of hot metal in the quenching tub, a final exhalation before the silence of the forest returned to claim the night. Kaelen's world was this small, this ordered. It was a life built on the foundations of what was lost, a quiet penance paid in sweat and soot. The forge was old, its stones blackened by the work of his father and his father's father. It stood at the edge of the known world, a last punctuation mark of civilization before the wild woods and the broken teeth of the mountains began in earnest. He kept to himself. The occasional trapper or woodsman might bring a broken axe or a bent snare hook for mending, paying in smoked meat or a few hard-won coins. They spoke little. Kaelen preferred it that way. Words were for people with futures to plan. His was a circle, a simple loop of work and sleep, marked only by the slow turning of the seasons. His small cottage, attached to the forge like a limpet to a rock, held the stale smell of smoke, iron, and old winters. A single chair, a table, a bed. Everything had its place. Everything was worn smooth by use. He had taught himself not to see the empty spaces, the places where another's belongings might have once rested. To see them was to invite the ghosts, and the forge was loud enough to keep them at bay most days. But not all days. On this night, the rhythm was broken. A late autumn storm had descended from the mountains, a howling beast of wind and rain that lashed the trees and turned the path to black sludge. The forge was dark, the coals banked to a sullen orange glow. Kaelen sat at his table, cleaning a set of tongs, the scrape of the wire brush, a small, familiar sound against the storm's fury. He was thinking of nothing, which was his preferred state of mind, when a sound that was not the wind slammed against his door. It was not a knock. It was the thud of a heavy body, a desperate final impact. He froze, tongs held tight in his hand. No one came here after dark. No one came here in a storm. His heart, a sluggish and forgotten muscle, began a hammering that rivaled his own forge work. He was not a warrior. The heaviest thing he swung was his hammer, and it was a tool of creation, not destruction. He listened. A low groan cut through the wind, a sound of profound pain. Against every instinct for self-preservation that had kept him alive and alone for 5 years, he moved. He unbarred the heavy oak door and pulled it inward. The storm roared in, and with them, a shape collapsed over his threshold. It was an orc, a female. And she was not alone. 2 others stood behind her in the driving rain, leaning on one another, their silhouettes huge and menacing against the churning black sky. They were all wounded. The one on his floor was a ruin of torn leather and gashed green skin. An arrow shaft, broken and fletched with black feathers, jutted from her shoulder. Her breath came in ragged, wet gasps. Kaelen's blood went cold. He saw torches then, distant and flickering, moving through the trees at the edge of the clearing. A hunting party. And these orcs were the quarry. This was not a plea for shelter. This was death arriving at his door, wearing a face of green skin and tusks. He should have slammed the door. He should have barred it and prayed they moved on, that the hunters mistook his forge for an abandoned ruin. It was the sensible thing to do, the sane thing to do. His quiet, circular life depended on such choices. But he looked down at the orc on his floor. Her eyes were open, slits of fierce, molten gold in the dim light from his hearth. They were filled with pain, with exhaustion, but also with a defiant fire that seemed to mock the storm. She was dying, and she was still angry about it. He did not close the door. He stepped back, an invitation, a surrender. He did not know which. The two standing orcs, half-carried, half-dragged their leader inside. They moved with the grim economy of soldiers. One of them, her face a mask of scars, slammed the door shut and dropped the heavy bar into place without a word. The sound echoed in the small cottage, a note of finality. He was trapped in his own home. The silence that followed was heavier than any hammer he owned. There was only the sound of the wind, the spatter of rain on the roof, and the labored breathing of the wounded orc. The two retainers stood over her, their hands on the hilts of crude, heavy blades. They watched him, their eyes promising a swift end if he made a single wrong move. They were broad, powerful, their muscles like knotted ropes beneath their dark leather armor. He could smell the wet pine, cold mud, and the sharp metallic tang of their blood. The leader, the one on his floor, tried to push herself up. A rattling cough shook her frame, and a trickle of dark blood ran from the corner of her mouth. She glared at him, a look that held no gratitude, only suspicion. "What is your price, man?" she rasped, her voice like stones grinding together. Kaelen stared at her. The question made no sense. Price? For what? For opening a door? For letting them bring their war into his home? He looked from her to her silent guards, then back again. The torches were still out there, drawing closer. "There is no price," he said, his own voice sounding thin and unfamiliar. One of the retainers snorted a sharp, disbelieving sound. "Nothing is free." "This is," Kaelen said. He felt a strange calm settle over him. It was the calm of a man who has already fallen off the cliff and is merely waiting for the ground. He had made his choice. The consequences would come as they would. He gestured towards the fire. "It's stale, the leader Graka. He would learn her name was—" Held his gaze for a long moment. She was testing him, he realized, looking for the weakness, the angle, the lie. He was just a blacksmith, and his world had just been invaded. His honesty was not a virtue. It was simply all he had left. "Urka," Graka commanded, her voice a low growl. The scarred retainer moved to the water barrel, ladled some into a wooden cup with surprising care, and brought it to her leader's lips. The other, younger but just as grim, kept her eyes fixed on Kaelen. He saw the gash, then a deep, wicked cut along Graka's side, poorly bound with a strip of bloody cloth. It was dark, inflamed, and smelled of sickness even from across the room. It was a mortal wound if left untended. He knew the signs. He had seen enough of them in the border skirmishes years ago, before he had retreated from the world entirely. He turned away from them and went to a small chest in the corner. Inside were his meager medical supplies, a few jars of dried herbs, some clean linen, a needle honed sharp enough to pierce leather, and a spool of gut thread. He took them out and placed them on the table. When he turned back, the younger orc, Zola, was standing in his way, her hand gripping the handle of a notched axe. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "That wound will kill her," Kaelen said simply, nodding towards Graka. "The arrow I can't do much about, not safely. But the cut, it needs cleaning, stitching." "We do not need a man's help," Zola snarled. "You do," Kaelen replied, his voice level. He looked past her to Graka, who was watching him again with that unnerving, golden-eyed intensity. "If you want to live to see the dawn." A tense silence fell. Graka coughed again, a deep, wet sound that spoke of fluid in her lungs. She looked at the supplies on his table, then at his face. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Calculation, desperation. She was a leader, used to making hard choices. Zola hesitated, then stepped aside, her expression a mixture of fury and fear. Urka helped prop their leader up against a stack of firewood near the hearth where the light was better. This close, she was overwhelming. She was bigger than him, even wounded and sitting. The raw power in her frame was obvious. A web of old scars crisscrossed her skin, pale lines against the deep green. But the new wound was a story of dying. "This will hurt," he said, his voice quiet. She gave a grim, humorless smile, showing a hint of tusk. "The world hurts." He took that as permission. He worked carefully, his hands moving with the practiced sureness of his trade. He cut away the filthy bandage. He cleaned the wound with boiled water and pungent herbs that made her hiss in pain but never cry out. Her muscles were knotted like ironwood beneath his touch. She was tense, ready to lash out, but she held herself still. Urka and Zola watched his every move, their hands never straying from their weapons. He could feel their murderous intent, like a physical pressure on his back. He threaded the needle, he stitched the flesh back together, his movements precise and economical. It was not so different from mending a tear in a leather bellows, though the material was warmer, more alive. He did not think about who she was, or what she was. He thought only of the task, the tear, the thread. It was work. And work, he understood. When he was done, he packed the wound with a poultice of moss and yarrow, and bound it with the last of his clean linen. He could do nothing for the arrow in her shoulder but break off the shaft to make her more comfortable. Pulling it out would likely do more harm than good. He sat back on his heels, the work finished. The adrenaline faded, leaving him weary to his bones. Graka looked down at his handiwork. Her breathing was still shallow, but the ragged edge was gone. The immediate threat of bleeding to death had passed. Her expression was still guarded, but the raw hostility had been banked, like the coals in his forge. "You have a smith's hands," she said. It was not a compliment, merely an observation. "I am a smith," he replied. He stood, his knees cracking, and returned to his side of the room. He felt as if he had crossed some invisible line. He had touched her, mended her. He had involved himself. His quiet, circular life was well and truly broken. Outside, the torches of the hunters had disappeared, likely having given up the search in the worsening storm. A temporary reprieve, he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that they would be back. At least, not in a way he recognized. They sat propped against the wall, their eyes closed, but their bodies held in a state of coiled readiness. He knew one wrong move, one sudden sound, and their blades would be in their hands. He did not sleep either. He sat in his chair, watching the fire die down, and listened to the breathing of the warriors who had taken over his home. He was a keeper of a dangerous flame, and he did not know if it would warm him or consume him entirely. Dawn came gray and weeping. The storm had passed. Kaelen rose and, moving with the quiet deliberation of long habit, began his morning routine. He added wood to the fire, filled the kettle with water. He expected the orcs to stop him, to question him, but they merely watched, their golden eyes tracking his every move. He made a thin porridge of oats and water, the only food he had in any quantity. He ate his portion standing by the hearth. He left the pot on the fire. An offering. Urka, the scarred one, was the first to move. She took the pot, ladled 3 portions into their own rough-hewn wooden bowls. They ate quickly, without speaking, like wolves. But when they were done, Urka took the pot and their bowls to his washing basin and scrubbed them clean with sand and water. It was a small thing, a simple domestic act, but it felt significant. They were not just taking, they were participating. Later that morning, while Graka rested by the fire, her breathing deeper and more even now, Kaelen heard the rhythmic chunk of an axe. He looked out his small grimy window to see her splitting his firewood with a brutal, efficient power that put his own efforts to shame. She worked through the pile methodically, her movements economical and strong. The other one, Zola, stayed inside. She prowled the forge, her eyes taking in every detail. She ran a hand over the anvil, tested the weight of a hammer. Then, to his surprise, she began to organize his scrap pile, sorting the pieces of iron and steel by size and quality. She worked with a focused intensity, creating order from his chaos, earning their keep in their own way. It was the pragmatism of the soldier, the survivor. A safe place was a place worth maintaining. He understood the logic, even if the reality of it, 3 orc warriors tidying his home, was surreal. He went to his workbench and picked up a damaged shield left by a traveling guard. Months ago the metal was buckled, the straps torn. He lit the forge, the familiar sigh of the bellows a comfort in the tense quiet. He began to work. The hammer's song filled the space, and for a little while things almost felt normal. He lost himself in the heat, the metal, the familiar dance of shaping steel. He worked through the day, the orcs moving around him in their own silent orbits. Urka brought in the split wood and stacked it neatly. Zola finished with the scrap and then began sharpening every blade in the forge, from her own axe to his small skinning knife, using his whetstone with a practiced hand. Graka mostly slept, a deep, healing sleep. That night, the tension had lessened, replaced by a shared exhaustion. They ate in silence again. Kaelen found himself watching Graka. In the flickering firelight, with the immediate threat of death having receded, he could see more than just the warrior. He saw the lines of weariness around her eyes, the way she favored her wounded side. He saw the immense weight of command she carried in the set of her shoulders. The hunters did not return. A second day passed in much the same way. Work, shared silence. The quiet domesticity of their arrangement was a fragile, unbelievable thing. Kaelen found himself mending their armor, stitching the leather, hammering out the dents in a pauldron. It was just work. It was easier to think of it that way. On the third night, The accumulated exhaustion of the ordeal finally caught up to him. He fell asleep in his chair by the fire, a half-empty bowl of porridge on the floor beside him. He did not dream. He woke hours later, a chill having settled into the cottage, but he was not cold. A heavy fur cloak smelling of pine and dried leather was draped over him. It was not his. He sat up, his heart thudding. The cloak was thick and warm, lined with some kind of dark fur. He looked across the room. Urka and Zola were asleep, propped against the far wall. But Graka was awake. She was sitting by the hearth, feeding small pieces of wood into the embers, keeping the fire alive. She did not look at him, but he knew she was aware he was awake. She had covered him. An act of care given silently, without expectation of thanks. It was a gesture so unexpected it left him speechless. It was a language he understood better than words. A reciprocal act. He had mended her body. She had given him warmth. He pulled the cloak tighter around his shoulders and watched her watch the flames. The firelight played across the harsh planes of her face, softening the scars, illuminating the gold in her eyes. The silence stretched, but it was no longer the heavy, threatening silence of the first night. It was something else. Something shared. "The mountains did not cast us out," she said, her voice a low rumble, addressed to the fire. "Our own blood did." Kaelen said nothing. He simply listened. It was not an invitation for questions. It was a statement. A piece of her story, offered into the quiet space between them. A fragment of trust. He thought of what he could offer in return. He looked around the forge at the tools his father had held, at the anvil that had borne the mark of his family for a century. "This forge," he began, his own voice quiet, "it was my father's." His father's before him. He paused, the next words feeling like pulling a splinter from an old wound. "My wife, she hated the smoke, said it got into everything." More than he had said to anyone in years, he had revealed a piece of his own history, the reason for his solitude. Graka turned her head and looked at him. Her gaze was steady, unpitying. It was a look of acknowledgement. She saw the shape of his loss, just as he was beginning to see the shape of hers. She gave a slow, single nod, and then she turned back to the fire. No more words were needed. The quiet of the forge, surrounded by the tools of their respective trades, his hammer, her axe, a fragile understanding began to be forged between them. It was not friendship. It was not an alliance. It was something more fundamental. A recognition. Survivor to survivor. A week passed. A strange, quiet rhythm established itself. Kaelen worked at the forge. They patrolled the perimeter, set snares, and maintained their gear, with a discipline that spoke of a lifetime of war. They spoke little to him and less to each other. They were a unit, and he was an outsider they happened to be cohabiting with. But the fragile peace was an illusion. He knew it. He felt it in the way Urka would pause her chopping to stare into the trees, or the way Zola's hand never strayed far from her axe. They were waiting. The hunters had not given up. They were simply being more cautious. The sign came on a cold, clear morning. Kaelen was checking the few rabbit snares he kept at the edge of the woods, a task that provided a welcome, if small, supplement to his diet of oats. He found one of his snares empty, the wire cut cleanly, and carved into the trunk of the birch tree beside it, was a symbol. A tusk, crudely rendered, with 3 jagged lines scored across it. It was fresh, the pale wood of the cut stark against the dark bark. He stared at it, his stomach tightening into a cold knot. It was a marker, a message. We are here, we know. He backed away slowly and returned to the forge, his steps heavy. He found Graka outside, watching Urka and Zola spar in the clearing. Their movements were brutal and efficient, a dance of feints and heavy blows with blunted practice blades. Graka's gaze was sharp, critical, missing nothing. "There's something you should see," he said, his voice flat. She followed him without a word. He led her to the tree. She looked at the carved sigil, and her face, already hard, became a mask of granite. He saw her hand clench into a fist at her side. "Gorgath," she said. "The name, a curse. He sends his scouts." "He toys with us. What does it mean?" Kaelen asked, though he already knew. "It means they are done watching," she replied, her golden eyes scanning the silent woods. "They will come soon." They did not have to wait long. They came that afternoon, not a large force, a scouting party, 3 of them, orc males, broad and heavy set, clad in mismatched iron plates and thick hides. They strode into the clearing as if they owned it, their arrogance a palpable force. The leader, a hulking brute with a notched lip that exposed one long yellowed tusk, stopped 20 feet from the forge door. "Blacksmith," he bellowed, his voice a gravelly roar. "We know you have the traitors, the blood heir and her pets. Send them out, and Gorgath may let you live." Kor. Kaelen stood in the doorway of his forge, a heavy hammer in his hand. It felt alien, not a tool but a clumsy weapon. His heart was a frantic bird beating against his ribs. Behind him, in the shadows of the forge, Graka and her 2 warriors stood ready. He could feel their lethal stillness. "No one here by that description," Kaelen called out, his voice tight but steady. It was a foolish, flimsy lie, but it was the only shield he had. The lead orc sneered. "Do not play games, manling. We smelled their stink on the wind for days. We saw the smoke from your chimney. We are not blind." He took a step forward. "Last chance." Graka moved beside him then, stepping into the light. She held her newly sharpened axe in one hand, its edge gleaming. Urka and Zola fanned out on either side. The time for hiding was over. "You seek me, Gorn." Graka's voice was calm, but it cut across the clearing like iron breaking. "Then you have found me. Go back to the dog who sent you. Tell Gorgath that the Stonefang Mountains will not bow to a usurper." Gorn laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Brave words for an exile with no clan. Gorgath is chieftain now. And he wants your head." He hefted his own massive, crude axe. "I will be happy to deliver it." The attack was sudden. There was no more talk. His 2 followers split, one heading for Urka, the other for Zola. Kaelen was not a warrior. He knew he would be a liability in a direct fight. But this was his home, his forge. As the 3rd scout rushed past him toward Zola, Kaelen acted on pure instinct. He swung a nearby stack of heavy iron-bound logs he used for anvil bases. They were off balance. He kicked the support loose. The entire pile tumbled forward, a chaotic avalanche of wood and iron that caught the charging orc in the legs. The orc went down with a surprised grunt, tangled and momentarily helpless. Zola did not waste the opportunity. Her axe fell once, a brutal final blow. The forge itself became a weapon. As Gorn pressed Graka back toward the entrance, Kaelen grabbed the long-handled tongs from the hearth, the ends still glowing a dull red from the banked coals. He swung them in a wide arc. Gorn focused on Graka, saw the movement too late. The hot iron seared across his unprotected face. He screamed a high, thin sound of agony, stumbling back and clawing at his ruined eye. Graka's axe swept up in a vicious arc that ended the scream abruptly. The last scout, fighting Urka, saw his leader fall. Panic broke his discipline. He tried to turn and run. Her blade caught him between the shoulder blades. He fell face first into the mud and did not move again. Silence descended on the clearing, broken only by the ragged panting of the victors. It was swift, savage, and absolute. 3 bodies now lay cooling in the dirt of Kaelen's home. The air, which moments before had smelled of pine and coal smoke, now carried the thick coppery scent of blood. The fragile peace had not just been broken. It had been butchered. Kaelen stood there, the heavy hammer trembling in his hand, his knuckles white. He looked at the dead orcs, then at Graka. She was breathing heavily, her face splattered with blood. She looked feral, dangerous, a creature of pure violence. And he had helped her. He had taken a side. Before anyone could speak, before they could even begin to process the violence, a new sound reached them. A war horn. Low, guttural, and chillingly close. It was answered by another farther to the east and a third to the west. They were surrounded. This was not another scouting party. This was the main force. From the tree line, a figure emerged. An orc larger than any Kaelen had ever seen, clad in black iron armor that seemed to drink the very light. A massive, 2-handed sword was strapped to his back. He walked with a slow, deliberate confidence, flanked by a dozen heavily armed warriors. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, his eyes sweeping over the scene. The 3 dead scouts, the 3 defiant females, and the lone human standing among them. "Well, sister," the large orc called out, his voice a deep, resonant bass that carried an unnerving civility. "It seems you have been busy. You har. I see you've even found yourself a pet." His gaze fell on Kaelen, dismissive and contemptuous. Graka's body went rigid. "Gorgath!" she spat. "In the flesh!" the warlord replied with a mocking bow. He ignored her, his attention fixed on Kaelen. "Human, you are harboring a declared outcast, a traitor to her clan. By the old laws, your life and property are forfeit. Your pathetic hovel will be ash by sunset." He then turned his chilling gaze back to Graka. "Graka, blood heir of the Stonefang clan," he announced, his voice booming through the clearing for all to hear. "You are declared outcast. Your claim is forfeit. Your life is mine to take. Surrender now, and I will grant your followers a quick death." Blood heir. The title hit Kaelen like a physical blow. It echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of his mind. Heir to a clan. Nobility. Royalty. Of a kind. He looked at the woman he had stitched up on his floor. The woman who had shared the silence of his hearth. who had covered him with her cloak. He had seen her as a refugee, a hunted soldier, survivor. Like himself, he had been wrong. She was a queen in exile. A cold, bitter wave of betrayal washed over him. He had not been helping a fellow outcast. He had been sheltering a political fugitive. His home, his life, his choice, it had all been predicated on a lie of omission. He was not a Samaritan. He was a pawn in a game of power he could not possibly understand. The quiet connection he thought they had forged felt like a fraud, a manipulation. She had used his isolation, his quiet humanity against him. His world was not just being destroyed by her enemies, it had been contaminated by her secrets. He felt a profound, aching hurt that was sharper than any fear. "You lied to me," he said, his voice low and hoarse. It was not an accusation meant for Gorgoth or the world to hear. Graka turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting his. He saw no apology in her eyes, only a grim, pragmatic resolve. "I told you what you needed to know to survive," she said, her voice flat. "The truth would have made you turn me away. I did what was necessary." Necessary. The word was like a slap. His safety, his life, had been a calculated risk in her grander strategy. "Surrender, Graka, or watch this man's world burn," Gorgoth commanded, growing impatient. Graka turned back to her foe, lifting her axe. "I surrender to no one, especially not to the snake who murdered our father." Gorgoth's civilized mask slipped. A snarl twisted his features. "Then you will die with him." He raised his hand and brought it down in a sharp, chopping motion. The attack began. From the woods, dozens more orcs emerged, a tide of black iron and snarling fury. Arrows rained down, thudding into the timber walls of the forge and the soft earth of the clearing. The siege was absolute. They fell back into the forge, barring the door just as the first heavy blows began to fall against it. An arrow punched through the wooden shutter of the window, embedding itself in the wall near Kaelen's head. The world had shrunk to this small, dark, noisy space. The splintering of wood, the war cries of the orcs outside, the hiss of arrows. Kaelen was no longer thinking about betrayal. Survival was a more immediate master. He was trapped. His fate was now tied to hers, whether he liked it or not. "The back wall!" Urka shouted over the din. "It's weaker!" They knew it was a matter of minutes before the walls were breached or the door was smashed in. Kaelen's mind, accustomed to solving problems of stress and structure in metal, began to work. He was not a warrior, but he was a smith. And this was his forge. He stoked the fire, throwing on fresh coal until it roared with a white-hot intensity. He grabbed long iron rods, pokers, anything that could hold the heat. Zola, seeing his intent, worked the bellows with a fierce strength. Graka and Urka braced the door, their bodies straining against the crushing force from outside. The door began to splinter. A heavy axe head punched through the wood. Urka met it with a savage kick that sent it recoiling. But more blows fell. The wood was failing. "Now!" Kaelen yelled. He pulled a long iron bar from the heart of the forge, its end glowing a blinding white. He passed another to Zola. When the door finally burst inward, torn from its hinges, the first two orcs to charge through were met, not with blades but with the searing tips of the iron rods. Their screams were horrific as the white-hot metal met flesh. They fell, creating a momentary writhing barricade in the doorway, but more poured in behind them. The forge became a chaotic melee. Kaelen was clumsy, slow, but he used his tools. He swung a heavy mallet, not to kill, but to break a knee. He threw a bucket of quenching water at an attacker's face, blinding him with steam and ash. He was a disruptive element, a piece of the environment fighting back. A thrown torch landed on the thatched roof. Smoke began to fill the small space, thick and acrid. Flames licked down the walls. His home, the repository of his entire life, of his family's history. He watched the workbench where his father had taught him to hold a hammer catch fire, the old, oil-soaked wood burning with a terrible speed. Everything was turning to ash. They were being pushed back, deeper into the burning building, towards the solid stone wall of the forge itself. They were 4 against dozens. Urko went down. Zola stood over her, a shield of fury, her axe a blur of motion. But they were being overwhelmed. Gorgath himself stepped through the broken doorway, his massive sword drawn. He dispatched one of his own wounded warriors who was in his way, with a contemptuous shove. His eyes found Graka through the smoke. This was the end. Backed against the hot stone of the forge, surrounded by enemies, their home burning around them. It was in that moment, with the roar of the fire and the clang of steel filling the air, that Graka did the last thing Kaelen ever expected. She turned to him, her face blackened with soot, her eyes blazing with a fire that dwarfed the one consuming the building. Her voice somehow cut through the chaos, clear and strong as a bell. "Kaelen of the Black Forge!" she shouted, her voice a formal declaration. "Stand with me." "Beside me." Gorgath paused, a look of incredulous fury on his face. Her own warriors stared. "Be my shieldkin, my forge mate," she continued, her voice rising with every word. "My home is gone. Let us build a new one. Together." It was not a plea. It was not a desperate bargain. It was an offer, a proposal. A public, political declaration made in the face of death, in front of her most hated enemy and her own loyal followers. She was offering him a place, a future, a purpose, even as their present was being burned to the ground. He looked at her, then at the flames devouring the last remnants of his past. The pain of her deception was still there, a sharp, cold thing in his chest. But her offer, it was not a lie. In her eyes he saw not the calculation of a politician, but the desperate, earnest plea of a leader who had lost everything but her will. She was offering him the one thing he had not had in years, a choice that led forward, instead of in a circle. He looked at Gorgath, at the sneering contempt for the manling pet. He looked at the burning timbers of the life he had so carefully, so miserably maintained, and he made his choice. He stepped forward, to stand beside her, the heavy smith's hammer held not like a weapon, but like a scepter of his trade. "Only if I am Kaelen," he said, his voice hoarse from the smoke, but clear enough for her to hear. The smith, not some pet, not a human shield. He was asserting his own terms, his own identity. He would not be her possession. He would be her partner, an equal. A fierce, triumphant smile broke through the grime on Graka's face. It was a terrifying, beautiful thing. She gave a sharp single nod. "Kaelen, the smith!" Gorgoth roared in fury at the display, the defiance. "Kill them! Kill them all!" But the moment had shifted some. Their stand had become legendary in the space of a heartbeat. Zola, seeing her leader's declaration, let out a piercing war cry. Urka, dragging her wounded leg, pulled the arrow from her thigh. With a grunt, the back wall of the forge, the one Urka had pointed out, was old stone. But Kaelen knew its weakness. A section where his grandfather had made repairs after a long-ago fire. It was mostly mortar and smaller stones. "The forge wall," he yelled to Graka, pointing with his hammer. "Behind the quenching barrel." She understood instantly. Their new alliance was already at work. Her strategy, his knowledge. Together, they shoved the heavy barrel of water aside. While Zola and Urka held the line against Gorgath's warriors in a desperate final stand, Graka and Kaelen turned their fury on the wall. His hammer, swung with the full power of his blacksmith's arms, smashed the mortar, breaking the stones loose. Stone and mortar crumbled. A hole appeared, then widened. On the other side was the darkness of the forest. "Freedom! Go!" Graka commanded Zola and Urka. Zola half carried the wounded Urka through the opening into the relative safety of the night. Gorgoth saw his prey escaping. He shoved his way through the melee, his greatsword swinging. Kaelen saw him coming and did the only thing he could. He upended the forge itself, a desperate act of leverage and strength. A river of burning coals, white-hot and deadly, spilled across the floor directly in Gorgath's path. The warlord bellowed in pain and rage as the coals seared through his boots and leather greaves, forced to stumble back. It bought them the seconds they needed. Graka grabbed Kaelen's arm, her grip like iron, and pulled him through the opening in the wall just as the burning roof finally gave way, collapsing inward in a shower of sparks and flame. They scrambled into the woods, plunging into the darkness, leaving the inferno behind. They could hear Gorgath's enraged screams, the chaos of the fire, but they had the cover of the forest, a forest Kaelen knew better than any of them. They ran, leaving the only home he had ever known to become a funeral pyre for his past. He did not look back. There was nothing left to see. They traveled for weeks, moving through the deep woods and into the foothills of the Stonefang Mountains. Kaelen's knowledge of the hidden paths and game trails kept them ahead of Gorgath's trackers. Graka's grim determination and the unwavering loyalty of Zola and Urka kept them moving. Urka's leg wound healed slowly, a painful nagging injury that she bore with stoic silence. They finally reached their destination, a hidden enclave, a small fortified village nestled in a high, defensible valley. This was the heart of the resistance, the last bastion of those loyal to Graka's bloodline. They were welcomed as heroes returned from the dead. But Kaelen was welcome to something else. He was an outsider, the manling, the soft skin. He was met with suspicion, with open scorn. The orcs of the enclave were hard, grim warriors, their culture forged. In the unforgiving mountains, they saw him as a weakness, a strange pet their deposed heir had brought back from the lowlands. Whispers followed him through the smoke-filled halls of their mountain hold. He did not try to answer their scorn with words. He had never been a man of many words. He did not try to prove himself with a blade. He was no warrior, and to pretend otherwise would be a fool's errand. He did what he had always done. He worked. He saw their broken tools, their dented armor, the poorly made hinges on their gates. Their smith was old, his hands gnarled with age, his skills limited to crude repairs. Kaelen found the abandoned corner that served as their forge. It was a pathetic setup, a pile of rocks and a leaky bellows. He set about rebuilding it. He used his knowledge to build a better hearth, one that drew air more efficiently and burned hotter. He organized the scrap, just as Zola had done in his own forge. Then he began to mend their world. He started small. He sharpened their axes until they could shave hair. He repaired the buckles on their armor. He forged new arrowheads, balanced and deadly, far superior to their crude, hammered points. His hands spoke a language they understood: competence, quality, strength. The orcs would watch him at first with contempt, then with curiosity, and finally with a grudging respect. He worked from dawn until dusk, the steady, rhythmic song of his hammer becoming a new heartbeat for the enclave. He asked for nothing. He simply worked. His face blackened with soot. His movements economical and sure. Graka did not protect him from the prejudice. But she would come to the forge at the end of each day. She would bring him a bowl of stew, a mug of bitter tea. They would sit in the comfortable silence they had first discovered back in his cottage. He was her forge mate, and in these quiet moments that was all that mattered. He learned more about her, not from words, but from watching her lead. He saw the burden she carried, the weight of her people's survival. He saw her resolve, her fierce intelligence, and the moments of doubt that she only ever let him glimpse. He was her anchor, the one part of her new life that was steady, reliable, and true. He forged the tools of her war, and in doing so became an indispensable part of her fight. Months passed. The enclave grew stronger, bolstered by the quality of the weapons and armor that came from Kaelen's forge. His place was no longer questioned. He was Kaelen's smith, a title of respect. He had proven his worth, not with muscle, but with skill, not with a warrior's fury, but with a craftsman's quiet integrity. One evening, as the first snows of winter began to dust the high peaks, Graka came to the forge. She was preparing to lead a critical raid on one of Gorgoth's supply lines. She wore a suit of black iron plate armor he had spent the last month crafting for her. It was his masterpiece, each plate perfectly shaped to her form, offering maximum protection without sacrificing mobility. It was stark, unadorned, and brutally functional. It was her, in steel. He moved around her, making the final adjustments, tightening a leather strap here, checking the articulation of a joint there. The air was thick with the familiar smells of hot metal, oil, and coal. "The elders mutter," she said, her voice low. "They say no man wants an orc with scars." He paused in his work. He looked at her face. The firelight from the forge danced across her skin, highlighting the web of old battle scars. He saw the faint, pale line on her cheek from a long-ago fight. He saw the fresh, still pink scar near her temple from the battle at his forge. Each one was a testament to her strength, her survival. Each one was a part of the story he had come to know. He reached out his calloused, soot-stained thumb, gently tracing the edge of the oldest scar on her jawline. His touch was sure tender. It was the same practical, caring touch he had used to stitch her wound all those months ago. But now, there was no fear between them, only a deep, unshakable trust. "Then no man has looked close enough," he replied, his voice quiet but firm. Her fierce, golden eyes met his. In their depths, he saw not a queen. And he knew, with an absolute certainty that settled deep in his bones, that she saw him not as a human, a pet or a smith, but as Kaelen. He finished fastening the final buckle on her gauntlet, his hands steady. Hers was about to begin. They stood together in the warm glow of the forge, a smith and a warrior, a human and an orc, partners. They had lost one home to fire and war, but here, in the heart of the mountain, in the rhythmic beat of the hammer and the unwavering loyalty in each other's eyes, they had forged a new one, stronger than stone, truer than steel.